So I'm going to talk about management and environmental impacts on walnut quality. And some of the factors that can affect walnut quality are the variety. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The orchard planting configuration, diseases such as botryophilia or blight, direct insect damage to the hull from husk fly, shaking nuts with green hulls and not removing the hulls immediately. So if you let those nuts with green hulls sit on the orchard floor or in a truck, that can cause a huge decrease in the quality. Hot conditions during harvest, leaf loss due to shading, disease, or water stress damage without leaf loss, and then the nuts being wetted on the orchard floor by irrigation or rainfall, the nuts that fall onto the floor naturally, and then overly wet conditions, trees that are wetter than the baseline. And often these quality problems occur in the lower canopy shaded positions. When I first started this work, the grower we were working with told me that he could reach all the quality problems pretty much when he stands by the trunk on the tree, which is somewhat true. A lot of those problems occur right down there where the maximum amount of shading is taking place. And it also occurs a lot more commonly when orchards are above 80% or so canopy cover, because then you start losing more canopy. If you see these quality issues higher up in the tree, such as here, where you see these black nuts up in sunlit positions, that's a sign that most likely there's more severe irrigation-related problems involved, as well as shading. This is a paper from 1978 by Dave Ramus, who was one of my predecessors. And at that time, pretty much when you had dark pellicles dark kernels in walnut, it was due to stress from lack of water, as in this case. You can see on the dry on the left side, you can see 2/3 of these nuts have severe darkening, and they're all pretty dark. Now we see the exact opposite. We rarely see dark pellicles from lack of water, but more commonly from excess water. If we do see it from lack of water, it's from the situation that Ken described, where the orchard's too wet early in the season, and then it gets stressed later in summer. But we don't see that often in terms of at least severe enough stress to cause quality problems. And this just shows the development of a nut. In May through June, the nuts are growing in size. So if you stress the trees during this time, you can impact the nut size. And then during July and August, this is when the kernels are filling in and sizing, and you can get shrivel if you stress the trees during this time. And then during August and into early September, stress can result in impacts on the pellicle, kernel color. First, I want to talk a little bit about what influences nut size. First of all, the previous year carbohydrate storage in the bud has an influence, the current year light conditions, and the current year nutrition and water status. This figure just shows the development of the nut. So the nuts are increasing in size until about the end of June. At that point, the nut has reached its full dimensions, but the kernel hasn't necessarily filled yet. And we started this trial in San Joaquin County. We started just at the point where these nuts had reached their full size, and then we defoliated. Well, I'll talk about that a little bit later, I think. I'll leave that for now. This just shows these peewee nuts. In this case, you have a normal split nut here, and next to it you have this peewee nut. What we found, this is actually in a full light lit position, so it's not due to shading in the current year. But what we think happens is with these peewee nuts, and by the way, these peewee nuts usually have a nice, well-formed, small nut. They rarely have any quality issues other than their size. And we found that peewee nuts are not related to current year conditions. In other words, they're not due to late bloom, but rather the small number and little expansion of leaves they have, even if they're in a good light position, suggests that this is due to the storage of carbohydrates from the previous year in these positions. So if you have positions that were exposed to sunlight due to hedging or pruning, they can have still have these peewee nuts, even though they're in a full sunlight lit position this year. Now, the other thing we see is these nuts that have brown adhering hulls. This is sort of halfway of a problem compared to the peewee nuts. So these nuts are about maybe 2/3 the size of a good nut in a good position. They sometimes have discolored pellicles, but often these nuts that split partially like this will have an okay kernel inside. This just shows, we did some measurements on healthy nuts on the upper row here. So they had 4.5 leaves average supporting each nut. And they had a kernel weight of about 7 grams and a shelling percentage of 52%. But then if you go down here to this brown adhering hull, which is this one over here, it had 2.3 leaves average supporting each nut. And then a kernel weight of only about half as much, 3.3 grams, and then a shelling percentage is much lower. And then if you go to this adhering hull here, this black adhering hull nut had lost basically all of its leaves. These on average only had 0.4 leaves per nut, and they had much smaller kernel weight and much lower shelling percentage. So this stress during this period from August through mid-September, this is where you can really get impacts on pellicle color. So the shrivel occurs, as I mentioned, from that earlier stress, but pellicle color problems occur a little bit later in August into early September. You can get these bright yellow pellicles, these bronze pellicles, and these black pellicles. These are kind of shocking when you open these black ones. People don't like to find that in a shell, in a nut that has a shell on it when you crack it. And I just want to mention that the pellicle is the skin on the kernel that gives it its color. Now in 2003, we worked in an orchard in Solano County that had a lot of these black nuts that lost all their leaves in the lower canopy. So we had set up this network of sensors. We had about 60 of these photodiodes, and we put them in all the way from the upper fully sun exposed. This is a mechanically hedged Tulare orchard. So up near the top, we put 3 sensors, and then in the middle area where it had about half the amount of sunlight, we put sensors. And then in the very bottom where all these black pellicle nuts or black hulled nuts were occurring, we put in these sensors. And this is what we found. These ones at the upper canopy are in the light blue here. You can see they got light through the whole day. So they got many hours worth of total sunlight over the course of a day. The ones in the middle got these blips of light and ended up with maybe 2 or 3 hours total sunlight. And then these lower ones, these pink ones, were down here, and they just got little blips of direct sunlight, maybe for 10 or 15 minutes a day total. And we found that these positions, if they received less than about 30 minutes of direct sunlight a day, you tended to lose all the leaves and get these black hulls. Now, mechanical hedging can really result in this dense canopy edge, which enhances these problems. This is what happens. You made this mechanical hedging cut here, and you generate 2 or 3 vigorous shoots, and these tend to make a wall of vegetation that shades the nuts in the interior. So we see a lot more quality problems in mechanically hedged orchards because of this vigorous growth. So this is what I was mentioning about the orchard configuration, planting configuration effects on quality. We see less quality problems in orchards that are planted at a more traditional spacing, like 25 by 25 or 30 by 30, than we do in ones that have a hedgerow planting of like something like 15 by 25 or 28 feet. We started these walnut quality studies in adjacent 9 and 13-year-old Chandler's orchard. Both of these orchards had a high percentage of midday canopy light interception, greater than about 85% at the time we started the trial. And both of these orchards had a history of producing these nuts with these yellow pellicles. So we again put these photodiodes in the tree from up in the upper sunlit, well sunlit positions into the lower shaded canopy. And you can see this is one of those sensors that was in an area that only received about 5 or 10 minutes of direct light a day. And you can see this leaf was in the process of abscising. So we put these sensors from up in the fully sunlit position. These were very tall trees, so this was pretty high up on the tallest ladder we had to reach these tags in the upper sun. Now we went down to the trunk and then back up the other side of the tree. So this is the east facing this way, and this is west facing this way. And this is the leaf specific mass. So we actually measured the weight of the leaves in these different positions. This integrates the amount of sunlight these leaves received over the course of the season. And you can see if we put that graph of this leaf specific mass onto the tree where these positions were, it pretty much aligns directly. So these positions got more light, these got less, and then more light again up here. Now in the 13-year-old orchard, the grower had observed that by this age, these problems tend to start going away, and you can kind of see what happens here. You don't have any of these really low light positions. So these positions have been lost, probably because in this case, the orchard is still being formed out here. And so you're constantly shading new positions in the interior. Once you get to this stage, the orchard's not being pruned anymore. And so probably these lower positions have all died out, and these positions here are, what we found is these positions down in this area actually produce nuts only every 2 or 3 years at this stage, rather than every year or two if they're in a better lit position. This just shows some of the shriveled nuts on some of those, the most severe stress trees. And nuts that don't split normally and maintain wet conditions around the hollow are what cause these pellicle color problems. In this particular case, this nut was in a trial we had at Nichols Soil Lab, and the right half of this nut split normally, and the left half, the hull adhered to the shell. And you can see just that left half where it was adhering caused this blackening of the pellicle. So what we did in this trial in San Joaquin County is we artificially defoliated spurs in these lower canopy positions at about 10-day intervals starting in early July and going through September. And this was during the period after the nuts had achieved their full size, but the kernel was filling. So this is the first date, July 7th. You can see the kernel weight was less than 1 gram. So they were just increasing during this whole period of the time that we were defoliating. And this is what we found in terms of shrivel. These ones that were defoliated early on, in the beginning of July, had severe shrivel in about 8% of the nuts. And then the slight shrivel occurred across this zone all the way through the middle. Now, when we look at pellicle color problems, this is what happened. Well, first, thin shells. So if you have stress during June, you can get this very thin shell where you can actually see open shells when you look in the harvest cart, or open exposed kernels or pellicles being seen because the shell is broken. And in early July, you get severe shrivel. Early August, slight shrivel. And also early August, you can get this yellow pellicle color. Then the black pellicle color tended to occur in mid-August, and the bronze in late August and early September. And this is what we found in terms of reflective light index. The reflected light index is just measurements that Diamond does in their quality analysis, and the lighter the color, the higher this number. And what we found is that the average midday stem water potential, somewhere, the baseline in this case would be about 4.5 bars. The best lightest kernels occur at about 2 bars, a seasonal average water potential about 2 bars below that. If you look at relative value, you see a similar sort of pattern. The value goes down as these trees are running wetter through the season. So this just shows the baseline in this case would be about 4.5 bars. The lightest nuts in all 3 of these trials occurred at about 2 bars below that level. So this is wetter as you're going towards the right on this axis. So we did another more detailed quality study on a trial we had on campus in conjunction with Carlos Crisosto's lab. And in this case, we looked at the effects of irrigation and harvest date on storage characteristics for Howard and Chandler. We had 2 harvest dates, an early date and then a later date about 10 days or so later. And then we also had the irrigation impacts of this excess water and the normal water. And this shows the data for Howard. In this case, the lighter nuts are, as you go down, these are getting lighter. This is the average percent light nuts. And you can see on the early harvest date, then these were stored for either 4, 8, or 12 months. The early harvested nuts maintained a better color all the way through, you can see, but it decreased during that storage period. The nuts that were harvested later had the same pattern, but they started at a lower or a darker pellicle color. Now in this case, these results are using this color scheme from DFA. So the darker kernels here are going up. So this is the same storage data for Howard. You can see they're getting darker as they're stored. The early and the late have a different pattern. In Chandler, the early and late both followed the same pattern, and you can see these scales are actually different. These go to 0 to 4, and this goes from 1 to 3. So the Chandlers were not really affected by the early and late harvest, unlike the Howards. This just shows the same data. You can see for Chandler, only the maturity was significant. For Howard, it was both the maturity and the irrigation caused an effect on the pellicle color. Now, we also did a study looking at the variability within trees from the most and least stressed trees from this trial on campus, where we were intentionally overwatering trees. And in this case, all 10 of these trees and kernels in a vertical column are from the same tree. And what we did is we looked at the pellicle color by 4 different methods, those CDFA color charts, the Minolta colorimeter, and the new image analysis system that Carlos Crisosto had. And then we also analyzed the data with Photoshop in our lab. And that's what this data that I'm presenting is from. This shows the Howards and the Chandlers that we were measuring the pellicle color on. In this case, we're measuring the luminosity. So the higher this number, the lighter the nut, or the lighter the pellicle. And you can see the midday seasonal average midday stem water potentials on this lower axis. And you can see that this is the baseline here. So all these trees that were wetter than the baseline to the right of the baseline, you can see you get this huge variability in the pellicle color. You can get these really dark, these are really dark nuts down here. These are really light ones. But once you got to trees that were above about 2 or so bars drier than the baseline, you didn't see this variability in color. You got much lighter color pellicle in general. This was both true on the bottom and the top. So we measured the top of the nut and then also the bottom, and we actually picked out the areas here where there wasn't any breakage, because we didn't want to include these broken areas in the color assessment. So this is, I think, what really causes these problems in overly wet trees, is you tend to get this wide distribution across the same tree in terms of the pellicle colors. I already talked about that. So this just shows some of that same data, showing that both the relative value down here and the seasonal average midday stem water potential tends to occur at a couple bars drier than the baseline. And if your orchard is approaching its yield potential, so if you're producing 3 to 3.5 to 4 tons per acre, most likely you're going to start seeing these quality problems occurring in the lower canopy. And it can be, these problems can be greatly exacerbated by short-term stress. But if you're up in this range, 70, 80, 90% canopy cover, you're probably going to see some of these quality problems in the lower canopy. And in order to keep the lower canopy positions alive and productive, you need at least a half hour of sunlight hitting directly on those positions over the course of the day. As the orchard gets above about 70% interception, or 3 tons per acre, these lower positions will be continually shading out, and this can result in quality problems. Now, we've also found that in our pruning trials that if you prune an orchard heavily, you get this round shape of a tree on the left. If you get more of a central leader design, you get much slower. So in these traditionally pruned orchards, the centers die out much more quickly. In these modified central leader type trees, this occurs a lot more slowly because it's a shorter light path to this, down to this area near the trunk. Now, when you mechanically hedge, as I mentioned earlier, you generate all this dense growth along the edge of this hedging cut, and you can create this quality problem across the whole orchard row. Whereas here you only get it near the trunk on these traditionally spaced trees. In this case, you can get it all the way down the hedgerow. So there are real benefits to improved pruning and water management in low price years. Less pruning, you get increased water use efficiency. We found that when you're not pruning these trees, you need 10 inches less water compared to the unpruned trees. Sorry, you need 10 inches water in the unpruned trees compared to the pruned trees, because you're generating all this vegetative growth that's not productive. So you're producing more crop with less water in the unpruned trees. We had to plug emitters in this orchard in order to keep these trees from being too wet. So Ken mentioned earlier about in his talk about the fact that if you stress these, or if you irrigate these trees too much early in the season, you tend to get more stress later in the season. This is the only place we really see these quality problems occur from dark pellicles from lack of waters in these orchards that were too wet early in the year. But if you irrigate properly early on, you get better tree health, better kernel fill, improved color, and increased returns. So nut size can be influenced by previous year nutrition, water status, and light availability. For example, peewee and brown adhering nuts, those are both related to the previous year nutrition. Current year nutrition, water status, and light availability can also influence the size. In particular, the kernel shrivel and can be influenced quite a bit by the current season management. Nut quality problems can be associated with current season problems, as I mentioned. Thin shell from stress in June, severe shrivel from early June, slight shrivel from early August, and then these pellicle color problems occur in August through early September. And then excessively wet conditions, water potentials at or wetter than the baseline, are likely responsible for much of this bronzing from our experience. This often results from putting on extra large irrigations before cutting off water, before they're going to dry down for harvest. Ken talked a little bit about this. And Chandler is generally much less sensitive to these wet conditions than Howard or Tulare. If you have color pellicle problems, pay close attention to water management in August and September, and don't put on resist the urge to put on an excessively big irrigation before harvest. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have these problems with the buds that developed in relatively shaded positions the current year, and then if you expose those to full light with mechanical hedging or pruning, those nuts are still not going to size to a nice size nut. So this is just a summary on the top, a normal healthy tree. And then on the bottom, this shows what happens if you stress during this period of May and June. You get smaller nut size, thin shell if you're stressing it in this late June period, severe shrivel if you stress during early July, slight shrivel if you stressed from mid-July through early August. And then you start getting these pellicle color problems during August into early September. Usually because of leaf loss due to stress. So things you can do to improve nut quality: train trees to a central leader. Use a more traditional spacing. We tend to have less quality problems with these traditional spacings. Avoid mechanical hedging if possible. Proper irrigation management is really important. Delay the irrigation in the spring, as Ken talked about, until the trees tell you it's time to irrigate. Avoid stress from excess or lack of water in late summer, and harvest in a timely manner and sweep and pick up nuts as quickly as possible after shaking. So that's all I had. I wanted to thank the California Walnut Board and Diamond Foods, and I don't know if I have time for questions or not. I don't know if there are any questions. I haven't looked at the chat.
Thank you very much, Bruce. That was a very informative presentation, and we do have you put us a little more back on time, so we have just a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, I don't see any in the Q&A at the moment, but we'll give folks a chance.
And I can answer them online if they come in later.
Sure. So yeah, that was a lot of exciting stuff I had not seen. So really nice to see that. We are at 9:53. We're scheduled for a break at 9:55. And if we don't get any questions, I think we'll just move ahead and to the break, which, oh, we do have a question now. So how far below baseline should irrigation begin? 2, 3, 4 bars?
Somewhere in that range. Probably not before 2 bars. I think 2 bars is fairly safe.
And that was the general, was there a general threshold where you started to see that? I think that's the number that you and Kevin generally talk about, right?
Yeah, I think that's
is that where the quality issues begin?
Well, and that's also where we get the best average 2 bars below the baseline. Is where you get your best color too. So it's kind of a good target to shoot for. But you, as Ken showed in his data, you will probably get a little bit smaller nuts if you're irrigating to that level. So whether or not the quality improvements make up for that, it depends on your situation, I think.
Okay. Another question.
Bars below
okay, why?
Because baseline was really developed to generate the most growth, I would say, to where the trees grew the fastest and you didn't see any problems with excess water. I mean, the Walnut baseline, I believe, Ken, was just sort of developed from the work with Joe Grant in San Joaquin County.
It was kind of developed over many years by just looking at VPD and, you know, what numbers people got for healthy orchards. So yeah, it's a ballpark number, but as you say, it's probably based on a modestly wet tree right after irrigation.
Yeah, so I usually say that you want to approach the baseline after irrigation, but never get there.
So we have a couple of questions that came in the chat. Preferably, please try to put them in the Q&A. Okay, let's see.
Go ahead and, Kamiar, go ahead and ask the questions that are in the chat. I can't place them in the Q&A, so.
So one question is, would you irrigate young trees prior to tomorrow's freeze if they're still dormant?
It's probably not a bad idea. I don't know what others think. It depends, I guess, how much moisture you have in the soil. Now, our data loggers here in Yolo County are showing pretty much field capacity all the way down from the early rains. Even though we haven't had any rain for 60 days, we're still at field capacity. So it depends on your situation, I think. You don't want to put on water if you're already at field capacity, probably.
And you don't want standing water when the freeze comes, because that's just going to freeze over and prevent, you know, stored heat from re-radiating back towards the canopy. So unless you're doing active frost protection and always having continual freezing water, you'd like to ideally be at field capacity going into it, not having saturated soil standing water.
Thank you, Luke, for chiming in on that. Question from Pat Brown was, what makes the pellicles yellow?
We don't know. Abhi's done some work on that, but I don't know. I don't think he's on here, but I don't know if he's really figured that out. He's tried looking at what's going on in terms of compounds that are produced, but we don't really know. I don't know if Carlos is on here either. He may have some ideas too.
And then maybe the last question. This is from Bob Beatty. Were the stem water potential values in your charts the measured value or the value below baseline?
I don't know which charts you're referring to. Let me look real quick.
In general,
the charts that I presented were actually not difference from baseline, but the actual water potential, I believe.
That's the impression I had too.
Yeah. Yeah, those were just the seasonal average water potential.
So unless there's any other comments, especially about frost, which is of course on everyone's mind, I think we can just go right into the break until 10 after 10. Thanks very much to the presenters in this session, the first session of the morning, and we'll continue at 10:10. So have a good break, and thanks for joining us.